Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to untangle a really wild connection. One that links the price of your groceries to global nuclear treaties. I know, it sounds a bit out there, but stick with me. It's a story that stretches from the shopping aisles in Brazil all the way to the corridors of global power. So let's get into it. Okay, so how on earth do you connect a carton of milk to a nuclear warhead? Well, the journey doesn't start in some secret military silo. Nope, it starts in a supermarket, right in the middle of the economic chaos of 20th century Brazil. All right, so let's set the scene. We're in Brazil, mid-20th century, and the country is just stuck. It's caught in this relentless, decades-long cycle of one ambitious economic plan after another, and every single one is a desperate attempt to tame this monster, this beast of runaway inflation, and just finally, get some real sustainable development going. You see, for decades, leader after leader in Brazil was wrestling with the exact same problem. How do we get this economy stable? How do we make it grow? They were just trapped in this vicious cycle of super high inflation, their currency reserves were always draining away, and they were constantly desperately trying to get foreign investment that often never came. And this table here, it just perfectly lays out that cycle of trial and error. You had the Plano Salti, which kind of fizzled out because they couldn't get private investors on board. Then the Plano de Metas, okay, this one delivered some seriously impressive growth, but boom, it also came with crippling inflation. Then you get the PEG plan, which people called an economic miracle, but it came at a huge cost, massive inequality. It was like every time they solved one problem, a brand new one popped up.
And then we hit the 1980s, and this whole cycle just goes into complete overdrive. It was a period so chaotic they literally call it the lost decade. I mean, they were just rolling out one plan after another. You had the Plano Cruzado, the Plano Bresser, the Plano Varau. The list just goes on. And guess what? Each one failed. And every failure just pushed the economy deeper and deeper into this terrifying hyperinflationary spiral.
But then, finally, in 1994, something different happens. The Plano Real. And this wasn't just another magic bullet solution. No. This was a really carefully staged, multi-step process. First, they focused on getting the government's own finances in order. Then, and this was the clever part, they introduced this transitional currency unit to basically break people's psychological expectation of inflation. And only after all that groundwork was laid did they launch the new currency, the real. Now here's the thing. Even this really successful plan had to evolve. At first, they pegged the real one-to-one with the US dollar, and that worked. It stopped hyperinflation dead in its tracks. But that created a new problem. It made the whole economy really vulnerable to shocks, when foreign investment suddenly pulled out. So in 1999, they had to pivot. They switched to a more flexible system, a floating exchange rate, formal inflation targets, and that's what finally brought real, lasting stability. Okay, so why all these new policies like privatization and opening up the economy? This is where our story starts to get bigger. Because this huge shift happening in Brazil, it wasn't just some local decision they cooked up on their own. Nope, it was actually part of a much bigger story that was playing out across all of Latin America. So let's talk about that regional trend. Because this wasn't a coincidence. It was all being guided by a very specific and incredibly influential economic recipe, if you will. And that recipe has a name, the Washington Consensus. Now, this was a set of 10 policy recommendations cooked up by big international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and it was basically prescribed as the cure, the universal solution for all the economic messes that countries in Latin America were dealing with. And this table, this really gets to the heart of the problem, doesn't it? You can see the huge disconnect between the promise and the reality. They'd say, privatize your state companies, it'll make them more efficient. But what often happened was mass unemployment. Open up your borders to trade. It'll create growth. But for many, it just meant their local businesses got wiped out. This whole one-size-fits-all approach ended up contributing to some absolutely devastating financial crises in places like Mexico, Argentina, and other countries too. So that begs a really important question, right? If this recipe was so flawed, why did so many countries adopt it, and with such conviction? Well, the answer isn't something you're going to find in an economics textbook. To really get it, we have to look at something much bigger, a monumental shift in the entire global balance of power. All right, so we're zooming out again. We went from one country's economy to a whole regional economic doctrine, and now we're going to the entire global stage, right at the super dramatic end of the 20th century. And the timing here is everything. Look at this. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. The Cold War is over. And these massive geopolitical events created this huge political vacuum, and the Washington Consensus, it just rushed right in to fill that void. It pretty much became the only economic game in town for the developing world.
Think about it. For almost 50 years, the world was bipolar. You had two superpowers, the US and the USSR, constantly competing. Two completely opposing ideologies, capitalism versus communism, bottling it out. But when the Soviet Union fell, that entire world just vanished. It was replaced by what we call a unipolar moment. Suddenly, there's just one dominant superpower, the United States, and seemingly one triumphant economic philosophy. There just wasn't a major ideological competitor left on the world stage.
But to really get how different this new unipolar world was, we have to take a step back and understand the logic of the old world it replaced. And let me tell you, it was a terrifying logic, but it was also, in a strange way, a stable one.
Yeah, the Cold War wasn't just some intellectual debate. It was a full-on military standoff between two absolutely colossal, nuclear-armed alliances. You had NATO, led by the US on one side, and the Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviet Union on the other. And for more than 40 years, these two giants just stared each other down, constantly ready for a war that could literally end human civilization as we know it.
And this wasn't just some abstract theoretical threat. Oh no. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, that made it terrifyingly real. It was an absolute stark reminder of just how close we all came to complete nuclear annihilation. For 13 days, the entire world just held its breath, watching as the two superpowers stood eyeball to eyeball right on the brink. That's when the danger of the Cold War became real for everybody.
So to manage this absolutely existential threat, the superpowers, believe it or not, painstakingly built a whole system of rules. It was a huge effort. They created agencies like the IAEA to keep an eye on nuclear technology. They signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to try and stop the bomb from spreading to more countries. And eventually, with treaties like START I and II, they actually began the slow, incredibly difficult process of reducing their own massive arsenals.
And all of this created one of the biggest, strangest paradoxes of modern history. Think about this. The very existence of weapons powerful enough to destroy all of humanity actually made an all-out war between the superpowers irrational, almost unthinkable. And this grim reality, which had the perfect acronym, MAD, for mutually assured destruction, it created this really tense, really fragile, and frankly terrifying kind of stability in the world.
And that brings our whole journey full circle. We started with a grocery bill in Brazil, which led us to a global economic doctrine, which then took us all the way to the insane logic of the nuclear age. What we see is a story about interconnected systems and rules. The Cold War world, for all of its absolute terror, had a clear, if terrifying, set of guardrails in place to prevent the ultimate catastrophe. And that leaves us with one last, really crucial question for today. In our modern world, with its own complex and scary challenges, do we have those kinds of guardrails? Do we even understand the rules of the game as clearly as we once did?